Let's talk to William Clouston now, who's leader of the SDP, about a number of things, including social care, the NHS, and of course those 20 Labour councillors that have just quit because of Keir Starmer's leadership. Let's not sugarcoat it. They are miffed with Keir Starmer already, just 6 months into his hapless government. William, thanks for joining me on Talk.
Good to be here.
Tell us about the SDP, first of all, William Clouston, because many people think that you were kind of absorbed into the Liberal Democrats a few years ago, but you're still alive and kicking by the looks of it, as an organisation, I mean.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, it's an interesting story. Social democracy is different from liberalism, and we are the SDP, the members that resisted the merger with the Liberals. We survived, and in the last few years, we've been growing rapidly. So we had 20 candidates at the 2019 general election, 122 candidates last year, and we're growing and starting to win seats, taking seats off Labour in the big cities in the likes of Leeds and so on. So I'm very optimistic about the future.
Well, let's see what you stand for with regard to a range of issues that we're going to talk about. So first of all, Labour's decision to block this inquiry, this government inquiry into rape gangs. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's a disgrace. People have reservations about Musk getting involved in this, but frankly, anything that can bring this atrocity to public attention would be welcome, given that the establishment, the political parties, the major political parties, and many of the authorities have just mishandled this and pretended it's not happening. It's a disgrace.
Yeah, and often we need a loud voice, someone with influence, to get involved in order for sufficient light to be shone on such things, so that indeed they do get debated, but also that we get to the bottom of who is culpable. As I said on the show yesterday, those that are culpable here, whether they are council officers, council leaders, other politicians or senior police officers, should be taken through the legal process. They should be charged if there is evidence for such, prosecuted and imprisoned, because they themselves have allowed this to continue. So people, women, girls, would have continued to have been raped and assaulted because of the inaction by many of those in power. So yes, no, I thought you'd find it difficult to disagree with me with regard to Labour. So it'll only be Labour supporters that will defend Jess Phillips and Keir Starmer's decision. Let's talk about social care, something else that the Labour government seemed to be pretty hapless about. They promised in the run-up to the election that they would fix the problems of social care, the social care crisis, as I think they called it several times in Parliament, but have now decided that it's not worth fixing until 2028.
I think this is one of the most depressing announcements I've heard from this Labour government. It fills me with horror. It's about 14 years since Andrew Dilnot gave his report on social care, and nothing has been done by these useless establishment parties. The Tories and the Lib Dem coalition did nothing about it. The Labour Party have an opportunity, Russell. You know what their majority is? 174. 174 majority, and they're kicking this issue into the long grass.
And William, what would the SDP do differently then?
We would create a national care service. We know what the problems are. I mean, for Streeting and others to say, well, we should ask Baroness Casey to find out what the issue is. We know what the issue is. The issue is a patchy service. The service is basically stuck between NHS care for the very ill and local authorities picking up the tab in their areas, but the service that local authorities offer is very, very patchy. There is no national training plan. There is no solution to the funding crisis where people have to sell their homes and so on. We propose, the SDP proposes quite sensibly, a national care service to get a grip of this. Actually, Labour has also has a similar policy, but is not, and it actually has the power to do something about it, is not doing anything about it. It's a disgrace. The Labour Party have put this into the long grass. Nothing, due to the timescales now, will be done before the next general election.
Well, it won't be done this Parliament, of course. That's pretty obvious. And I think that's, you could be forgiven for being cynical that that's being done on purpose, because they believe that any solution will be potentially unpopular, particularly when it comes to taxation, albeit that the Labour Party don't seem to be that shy of raising tax. And with regard to money, of course, whether it's the NHS or it's the social care system, it does seem that despite cries from particularly those on the left for more and more money as the remedy for the problems within our public health and social care services, NHS managers are reported now to be earning another £1.1 billion in the last 10 years, taking manager salaries in the NHS to nearly £3 billion, but with absolutely no improvement in outcomes as a consequence whatsoever. Doesn't that rather indicate and prove that the problems of the NHS and indeed social care are one of not money, but organisation and efficiency?
I think organisation does matter. I think in the case of social care, you can't argue that money isn't an issue. It certainly is an issue. On the question of NHS managers, it is true, as you say, Russell, the total salary bill has gone up 70% in 10 years, and it's not clear to me or anyone else that the NHS is better managed as a result.
Well, it's clear to me that it isn't. I mean, when it comes to those things that have been targeted for those managers, I mean, although they're soft targets, there'll be no implication, there'll be no consequence for those managers for failing to hit those targets, whether it's cancer diagnosis and outcomes, whether it's waiting lists and so on. It seems that those managers have just taken the money and stuck two fingers up to outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, it's highly contested, this area. The salary bill's gone up and the number of NHS managers has gone up. The data on NHS productivity shows that it's fallen, so it's not working. I think actually it's not. I think there is a cultural issue here. I think some experts, Darzi said that the NHS is not overmanaged. The NHS Foundation claim that it's not overmanaged. But I think there is a cultural problem, Russell. I think right the way to local authorities and government in general, you've got a problem with direct decision-making. I think you have people who are inclined to pass the buck and not make a decision. If you go back to the 1950s, most hospitals were controlled by the almoner or a single manager who would make executive decisions directly about a whole range of things, and that was highly efficient. Now, before they can make a decision, they're inclined to say, well, let's get a consultant in to tell us what to do. So I think a lot of the problem, Russell, is actually not so much money, but culture, the culture of the management itself.
Yeah, well, and the lack of accountability, and get this as well. The figures within that £1.1 billion additional spend that relate to what are termed managers and senior managers. They are people with a salary in management terms of between £77,000 and £90,000. Now, putting aside the fact that I'm sure within those managers, that increase in number of managers in the NHS, there'll be the obligatory diversity and inclusion officers, those that run around with clipboards making sure that everything's nice and equal, inverted commas. But that's an astonishing amount of money for managers to be earning without any accountability in terms of the outcomes, the so-called successes that they are tasked with managing and overseeing. £77,400 up to £90,000 as an NHS manager. Talk about rewarding failure.
Yeah, I'm going to take your point entirely on the diversity, inclusion, equity posts. The SDP has a policy on that. Scrap the lot. They are divisive, they're not useful, and it's not just the cost of the post, Russell. It's not just the cost of the post itself. It's the cost that those people impose on the rest of the organisation, which is running around trying to do their work, basically, and getting on with a core function. So I totally agree with you on that. Yeah. You'll never get to a situation where, you can't rationally argue that something as big as the NHS shouldn't be managed. It needs to be managed, but I think the cultural problem is the biggest one. We have people in the SDP policy team who have worked at a very senior level in the NHS, and they'll vouch that. They say basically...
West Streeting also has said that those hospitals that do not perform, despite the increase in funding, will be called out. What I would suggest to Mr. Streeting is that the individuals should be called out, not just the hospitals, but the clipboard carriers, the managers, and indeed the NHS Trust chief executives. They are the one that should have the finger of blame poked at them, because they're the ones that are clearly failing. Can we talk about Sweden for a second, William? You may have heard the earlier segment where we were talking about Sweden's sudden pang of common sense. They have spent a decade or so allowing all and sundry into their country, hundreds of thousands of migrants, some legal and no doubt some illegal, many on the basis of them claiming asylum in Sweden. And lo and behold, over the last 10 years, particularly when it comes to serious crime, so assault, arson, explosions, criminality by way of gangs, Sweden has in effect fallen I mean, literally fallen under the weight of that migration. And they've now decided, yes, not before time, that they're going to close the doors. They're going to pull up the drawbridge when it comes to asylum claims and indeed giving benefits and money to such claimants. As a consequence, they've now seen a significant reduction in asylum applications, the lowest since 1997. When is Britain going to do the same?
Well, it should do it immediately. I mean, what's happened? Sweden wanted to be some sort of humanitarian superpower and engaged in this reckless experiment. It's been going on 30 years, but in 2016 it was supercharged. And you're quite right, as the result is failure to integrate the people that have arrived, a rise in gun crime and mafia activity, to the extent that a lot of Swedes don't feel safe in their own communities and their own cities. So it's collapsed.
So can we join the dots, William? I mean, can we say safely, on the record now, that there is absolutely a link between migration into European countries from other cultures and countries and crime?
Of course, because that's what the data says. And the states that have the data collectible and publishable, it always demonstrates that. Certain groups are vastly overrepresented in the crime stats for not just robberies, but for violent crime and rapes and other things. And the data's in there. Some states, France in particular, the UK is not very good at publishing data on this.
Well, we don't. I mean, Rupert Lowe from Reform has insisted that the government does so, and he's been resisted. Do you support him in his endeavours to have crime filtered by way of the data that's published by nationality?
I want the data published, and I applaud Rupert Lowe. I think he's done an excellent job since coming to Parliament. He's done a better job than the entire Tory party has in opposing the government. No, I think you can't, rationally, Russell, you can't have evidence-based policy if you don't have the evidence. And I want the evidence there, and I want it published. But Sweden, get back to Sweden's case. This has been a reckless experiment. It's failed. And basically, the worm is turning. The optimistic thing is that states that want to tackle it and reverse this experiment can do so. And I applaud the Swedes on doing it. I think it's long overdue. All of the reports that are published now, it's not just the crime and the other failures to integrate. The cost to the public purse, Russell, of some of these immigrant groups is colossal. There was a report published a couple of years ago by Jan van der Beek at the University of Amsterdam, and they estimated that some asylum migrant groups are costing the states they go to per person over €500,000.
Yeah, so over the lifetime of that person.
Over the lifetime of that person in that state. And, you know, most of these European states, Russell, are running public sector deficits. We can't afford this. We can't afford to borrow to do this.
But we have to have a realisation then, particularly in this country, as Sweden has just had the revelation that not all immigration is good and positive. William, we've got to leave it there, I'm afraid. William Clouston, leader of the SDP, thank you very much indeed for joining me.